All right, so why don't we start by you guys presenting your organizations and how do you relate to trust, or how, what trust, what kind of a place trust takes within the operation of your organization? Let's start with you, Jim.
All right, so I think you just heard a lot of the context from our demo. We are the number 4 background screening company in the world for enterprise level accounts. And we've been in this business a long time. What we actually do is, in our business, is verify credentials, specifically because historically there's been a very, very high incidence of fraud involving self-reported credentials, right? That's the whole purpose for the existence of background screening companies. As you may have heard in some of my video presentations I've done before, the challenge in our industry is that we spend an enormous amount of time and effort redoing over and over again the same credentials, using, quite frankly, antiquated methods in many instances, making phone calls. You know, it's a tremendously inefficient and difficult process, and it's error prone. Even, I mean, with the stuff we catch, there's stuff that leaks through. Background screens are not perfect. Right, and so, you know, I remember one of my first conversations with Dror. He was saying, you know, what do you see as the vision of background screening companies in this business? I said, we have to change the way we're doing business today. We need to adopt a new methodology to increase the amount of trust that credentials have, and stop doing this unnecessary work. And quite frankly, to be quite honest with you, the employment verification and education verification space is the least profitable part of our business because it involves the most labor and it's the most error prone. So, you know, I have been looking, and I told Dror I had actually tried to set up clearinghouses, which is essentially a different spin on the same idea. Years passed and never was able to get it off the ground. And so I saw this as really, the Velocity Network is the first true opportunity to really make a change in this space. And really, I saw it really more as a business problem, right? Getting the right players together to agree on a utility layer standard to interchange data with the added, and this is the key, and really blockchain is a little bit of a non sequitur. What's really the fundamental change here is public key cryptography. Right. So setting blockchain aside for a minute, the idea that an issuer is going to sign a record with a private key, and then on the public side, you have a public key which can be used to verify the authenticity of that record, or essentially you're checking the signature, right? That changes the game. Because now you don't have to worry about man-in-the-middle problems, people changing the records. Is the record true? You also don't have to worry about the person who's holding the credentials falsifying the records, because while they're holding the credentials, the issuer signed it, right? And so this now triangular approach, a different triangle, allows the trust factor to increase dramatically, right? We no longer have to worry about those records coming from the individual holder being tampered with. Because while they're holding the records, while they own the records, while the individuals publish the records to the verifier, they can't change them, right? And that's the critical element that has been missing all along, that has generated this rework over and over again, right? And, you know, there are proprietary databases that are out there that hold a lot of records of this type, and they charge an enormous amount of money to access those records, and they are of very poor quality. And, you know, we had to move to a different paradigm, I think, to really put the power in the hands of the individuals, and also remove the friction to get those credentials in a signed state where people could actually inspect them and verify them. So I think, to me, it's going to take a while. You know, we're talking about adoption that goes in fits and starts. We're talking about adoption. It starts with the major companies that are willing to take a leap of faith and actually put this in place that can actually see the long game and the benefits. But I think over time, having more and more of the credentials in Velocity Network is going to increase trust, right? We're going to get away from this state where everyone's seen the statistics. Up to 20% of the information on resumes is not true. That's the statistics, right? And so how do you get beyond that? Well, this is it. The key, though, is getting the pump primed, getting enough records, enough credentials flowing through the network that we can actually make a significant dent in it. And by the way, that's you probably saw that. Not all credentials are going to get in here at once. It's going to be a shift over time. So from our perspective, we'll see immediate benefit even if a few credentials are coming through that are like this. But the benefit will increase as the number of credentials grows. So if we can make this a virtuous cycle where we can get throughput to the network, it builds on itself, right? So the higher the fraction of credentials that we have flowing through the network, the more trust there will be.
Thank you, Jim.
Did you say 20% of information on a CV?
That's right. So, by the way, one of the things it was really interesting, this discussion earlier in the panel, where they talked about job specifications being excessive, right? So we've spent quite a bit of time in many instances with our clients unselling work they're doing on background screens. I'll give you examples. We have companies that are doing high school education verifications for jobs that don't, they have complete training programs for the jobs. They have no need to have an education qualification. Yet they were spending all this time and effort trying to verify high school diplomas. And of course, if you ever try and get a high school diploma verified during the summer, forget it, right? So we told them, stop doing it. It's a waste of time. And they said, well, the job description, well, why, and our point of view was, why does the job description say that? They don't need that. Well, it took a lot of time to convince, but we were able to get this one particular client convinced, and we've done this with other clients too. So I think it's interesting where this is going to go in terms of aligning specs, right? Figuring out what has to be done on backgrounds, what types of credentials are going to be driven through. And I think that's a work in progress. I think what I'm saying is we got to attack this problem from many different directions, right? You have to attack it from the adoption direction. We have to get major clients involved. We have to sometimes convince those clients to change the way they think about things. It's not just about sort of redoing old things and sort of just jamming in these initiatives. That might work a little bit, but you've got to have the fortitude, and the clients have got to have the fortitude to actually take a leap and actually change their processes and their thinking along with us to actually get the full value out of the network.
Thank you, Jim. So Jim is a consumer of trust, right? Jim is in a position to always ask, can I trust this source, right? Someone presented something, can I trust the source? The university send it over email, can I trust this? Can I trust this? Can I trust this? Robin, on the other hand, is busy convincing his customer and constituents that they can trust him. So he's the issuer of the data. So can you talk a little bit about your challenges in that space? Are you even asked, how can we trust that when you say that this individual is 26, he is 26 or she is 26?
So I think at the top level, not sure if that one's working. Cheers, Jim. Is that one working?
It's dead. This one's working.
This one's working, yeah. So trust is very, very important in society. All of us want lots of trust when we're interacting. Thanks.
They're dying. This one's
Working?
Battery.
Okay.
Good.
So, it's obvious that trust is really important in society. When I interact with people, even if I don't know them well, I'm hoping they're going to be trustworthy people. If you interact, you don't want to rely on contract law and police forces to hopefully have good interactions with people. It doesn't always mean you can't have relationships with people, but quite often, if it's particularly a business or there's money involved, trust becomes very, very important. it's very difficult to generate trust online. Yeah, it's much easier for fraudsters to do bad things online. They don't have to put their face in front of you and talk to you and lie, in front of your face. They can just do that behind a screen, and they can do it mass scale. And that's become a real big problem, and lots of fraudsters, kind of actually a few fraudsters we've spoken to say, one problem is we're going to do so much fraud, but eventually it will encourage people and businesses to do things to solve some of that trust and get rid of the fraud, which at the moment is too easy to do. So how do we kind of try and solve the trust issue? Because everybody immediately says, well, how can I trust that GMOing, using Yoti is actually GMOing? And that's a difficult thing for us to explain, because if we go into too much technology too quickly, people's eyes glaze over and they politely kind of go, I don't really understand some of that stuff, the biometrics, private and public keys, server-side, 256 AES. That isn't how you get people to understand trust online. So there's three things I think you can do. One is trust by association. Second is trust by accreditation. And third is trust by adoption. Some products, you can actually kind of see the quality in certain products. If that chair's really, really cheap, it's probably going to break after a few minutes of me sitting on it. If it's a good quality, well-made chair, I'm going to trust it and sit on it. But online, it's really hard to use the product to convey the trust, because you've got to start explaining all of some of those cryptography things. So instead, we kind of think, okay, the way that you're going to solve digital identity and credentials, and the massive value really is, it's like an iceberg. The digital identity is the bit above the water. You have to have that. You have to be sure that the name is the person who owns those credentials. But all of the value in society is knowing all of those credentials, starting with a few of the most obvious ones. I hadn't thought of layer 1 and layer 2, but I've learnt a lot the last couple of days. But that iceberg, there's huge amount of value in layer 1 and layer 2, and the technology which allows this to happen and the wave velocity can play that part. Massively important, but the customer actually needs to trust that there are big companies, trusted brands associating themselves with this type of solution. It's very valuable if you get accreditation. When the government in the UK basically said we're going to accredit companies to do right to work, just a few months ago, there's over 10 million right to work checks a year in the UK, 7 million criminal record checks and 4 million right to rents. All of those now are accredited for the first time to do online, and only a few companies are accredited to do them. So a lot of businesses now say we can trust and we can do these things, big businesses with accreditation. So there's two really important ways, but I think probably in the end the third most important way is adoption. As you begin to start doing this, companies will begin to see that they have less fraudsters putting less malicious rubbish on pieces of paper, creating completely fictitious pieces of paper. And as that happens, more and more businesses will begin to go, we're getting better quality information here and less fraudulent information, and more honest people being able to be putting things in which are verified by third parties. So that issuance allows people to begin to trust that, hey, this is actually a really good way of doing it. It will take time, but it will, over time, succeed, because the fraudsters can't win over time if they have to keep on trying to get around these systems. These systems are actually much harder than pieces of paper in Photoshop.
I agree. It starts with identity correlation, which is what you do, which is also very important to us. And then all the other records that are associated with that identity flow after that, right?
Yeah.
And I think so it's kind of two levels of trust that you got to think about, right? First is, are you dealing with the person you think you're dealing with? This goes back to Samantha's demo, right, where someone does a switcheroo problem and things like that. So those are things we have to think about. And then the second part is the credentials themselves. Adoption's a big issue. I'll point out, I think Dror's mentioned this before, we made a decision at the board level, network level, that notary issuers are going to have to be, like us, are going to have to be accredited by the PBSA to actually be able to issue credentials as proxies. And right, that's a major decision because it could eliminate a number of sources of proxy record issuers. But the thought of the board was that this is a credentialing aspect, right? You have the source of the credentials there's got to be a quality control element around the source of credentials because once the credential is put on the blockchain and is stored in a person's wallet, you can prove that credential has been tampered with, but it doesn't solve the source problem. So you have to make sure the source of the credential has integrity. Obviously, if it's the company directly, that's a very strong degree of assurance. But when you have proxy or notary credential issuers, there has to be quality control there. So we've implemented essentially minimum standards at the board level to ensure that's taken together, and that was the right decision.
And that leads me to the main course here in this discussion. So I think verifiable credentials is the worst name that this space could be getting. Because verifiable credentials are not credentials. They're containers of credentials, right? So what is a verifiable credential? It's a container where the issuer takes the data, takes the assertions that they want to make about the individual. Like, you studied here, you've graduated there, and you worked here. They put this, they sign on this document, they put it in the container, and they ship the container, right? Now, once the relying party receives that container from the individual, they can know 4 things about the document, quote unquote, that sits within the container, about the credential. They know that the credential has not been tampered with. Because if the individual tampers with the credential, then the signature will not match and cryptography will not match and a lot of other things that are not for this session. They know that the issuer is indeed the issuer of that document is indeed the issuer that is listed on the document because that issuer used their private keys and only that issuer has those private keys. They know that the credential is binded to an individual. That's what was raised by the decisive team and have been added to the roadmap of our protocol. And they know that the issuer, the original issuer, did not revoke the credential at any point after issuing the credential, because if the credential has been revoked by the issuer for whatever reason, then the verification protocol will pick this up.
By the way, I have to say that the revocation and then the revision, issuing another credential, was a loop that we talked about in detail with Velocity and was worked out very well. So occasionally credentials might be issued and need to be revoked for various reasons or need to be modified if there could be an error in the credential from the source. So we have the ability to revoke and then republish a credential, and that's the right way to do it.
But now the interesting thing, right? So all these things, right, are not about the authenticity of the credential itself. So I know that it hasn't been tampered with. I know that it came from the right source. I know that it's binded to the individual. I know it was not revoked. But some issuer said that I've graduated from the university, right? Put it in a container, shipped it. How do I know that they did graduate from that university? I don't. That's not Velocity Network. That's not the conduit, right? So my question to you is, how do you think, from your understanding of this space, how do you think relying parties should address credentials?
Well, I think if you look at the chip passport, so 71% of people in the UK and about 60% of people worldwide, when they create a YOTI and they add a passport, they read the chip. The chip basically is, we know, cryptographic, public-private key, government, fairly trustworthy issuer of passports. That concept's fairly well understood. People go through e-gates and begin to go, oh, biometric face matching to chip passport read lets me through the border. That's becoming quite well understood as more and more people do that. It makes it much easier then to talk to relying parties about, well, Robin John Toombs has got some credentials and we can share those and we can use all of that elegance in terms of the security around that credential is trustworthy, issued by a certain company, but it actually matches the person who's interacting with you because they've had to authenticate in their wallet. Their face matches the chip passport image in their passport and they're bound to some unique credentials. And that actually makes a big difference. This face is hard for fraudsters. It's a liveness test. It's a face that matches. And
But
it makes
Robin,
it very
I
tough.
want to make it harder for you.
Yeah.
So YOTI is currently the identity credential provider to the Velocity Network. So currently the only verification of identity runs through YOTI. So when I want to claim my identity credential, which is the basis of everything, right? I go through a process from my mobile, operated by your tech, and the result of that is that you issue me a verifiable, reusable, portable credential that attests to my identity. Now I share this as an individual with Jim, and Jim can now know that whatever I got from you was not tampered with. I got it from you. It's binded to me. You haven't revoked it, but maybe you did a shitty job. And it was my brother and not me that got the identity and now can use it because your tech is not tamper-proof.
So there's always those-
So how do you think Jim should address that
So
question
Jim,
mark?
So Jim over time has to trust as a relying party that credentials are secure, but also that when you share them, you've got to authenticate. You've got to use biometrics to basically say, hey, I'm about on my phone to give access or to share some credentials with somebody. Now, Jim doesn't know that we've definitely done that. We can obviously tell Jim that we've done that, and he may initially go, fingers crossed. But as you begin to see adoption, you also begin to get statistics as, well, how many times are people defrauding the system? How many times is the brother able to pretend to have the other brother's face to get through an authentication? In the YOTI system, we check all of our people who come into the YOTI system in the UK to the CIFAS fraud database, and they can't quite believe our fraud match rates because they're so low. And we say it's always been the case that if you basically put live faces into an identity wallet, all of the fraudsters will go and do other things. Yeah, it's really easy to go and do lots of fraud behind a screen with a web form. None of you can stop that. Yeah, somebody could be doing that right now, and they are not sharing their face doing that, or they're sharing a picture of a face with somebody who's not really doing any proper liveness. With a proper system, you do those things, and then trust begins to happen because companies begin to say, actually, these credentials seem to be very high quality. It's not 20% kind of stuff in the system which is rubbish or malicious. It's much smaller. There'll still be a few people who try and get around the system, but if it's 1 or 2%, not 20%, then people begin to embrace that type of system more and more. And then it gets much harder for fraudsters because they can't use Jim's real face. They've got to kind of, that's really hard to do. Screen attacks, paper attacks. These days, the AI can spot those things pretty well. Deep fakes, you've got to put a deep fake on a screen. You can spot screen attacks. NIST does that certification of people who've got that AI.
I think that's right. I think the combination of a very difficult to get around identity correlation, which is what you're talking about, right? Yeah. Coupled with issuers that have high integrity. And it is, look, not absolute. I'm not going to say absolute.
But that's exactly what Scott, that was supposed to be here and was attacked by COVID. that is his tune, right? Scott says, look, as long as you're not certifying issuers, your network doesn't worth anything, right? Because any university in some third world country would say that Jim got a master's in engineering, and then Jim has this, right? And he says, look, this is a loophole in that the entire notion of verifiable credential. You're verifying the credential authenticity, but you're not verifying the attestations that are on that credential. And I have my perspective on that. I just wanted to hear how you view it. Jim, I mean, that's a horrible picture of what we're trying to do here.
Well, I mean, I'll just take that thought train you're going down. I mean, one of the issues that we have to worry about is diploma mills.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, one of the things in background screening companies that we look out for, we have diploma mill lists. We look for those. I'll give you a good example of a organization that participates here, NSCH, which, you know, what role does NSCH play in the secondary education market? Well, they've done a lot of work to develop interfaces and with all the colleges, or most of the colleges in the United States and some across the world. Why do we pay the money to use NSCH records today? Well, because there's a high degree of reliability when you access those records that you can trust the information that comes out of it. Why is that? Because you know that NSCH has done their own homework, their own due diligence, they've set up interfaces, and so you know you're not dealing with no diploma mill college is going to have done an interface with an NSCH to produce fake degrees, right? So all the fake degrees come through individual lines of inquiry. So I think what Dror said is exactly right. Some degree of due diligence has to be done on the issuers, right? Which is why we put the PBSA standard in place for the notary issuers, and some degree of due diligence has to be done on any core issuer that's going to issue credentials on the network, so that origin of trust makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, go through trust by association, accreditation, adoption.
Yep.
If you accredit issuers, that's an awesome way of doing things, but it takes time, but it makes issuers think pretty hard. If I start issuing rubbish, I'm going to lose that accreditation, and then I'm not going to be able to issue any credentials at all. That's not a long-term successful business model, even for fraudsters. Association, you know, Harvard issuing something, particularly if somebody's kind of, you know, kicked the door and, you know, checked that the walls are there and it's Harvard, that's very valuable as well. And Harvard want to protect their brand, so they're not going to issue rubbish either, in my view, particularly if somebody in the network has checked that, you know, there is a Harvard that exists and it's the one that we all think it is. But also adoption. Yeah, if I begin to start issuing rubbish, yeah, just as with insurance, you'll end up with a database which says certain people go and get certain credentials from certain dodgy places, which then get into the system, and eventually a relying party says that was rubbish and they've defrauded us. And that name of that person, that issuer, ends up in the database of dodgy people. And at some point, risk scores for relying parties go, oh, you're accepting from somebody who's got a bad record of issuing credentials. So it will evolve. It's not perfect.
No,
that's partly how the
think,
world works.
I think that the conclusion that we all need to get or to take from here is that velocity network, right, is not the charter is not to enhance trust. That would surprise you. The charter is to take out friction of the ecosystem, because currently, right, the relying party, Jim or an employer receives self-reported credentials and then spend 5 weeks going to the source, right, to verify these credentials. So Jim will go to that third world university to verify that indeed that university has issued that credential, right? These are all taken off the ecosystem through that new conduit. But then Jim will say, okay, that's verified, but it's bullshit. I know that this university is an education mill. Or I don't know this issuer, so I'm not going to take it. Yes, it came from that issuer, but I'm not going to take it under consideration. The point is that we haven't taken out the human factor of the weighing and calculating and the decision making around the credentials. We can just assure that the credential indeed came from that source and has not been tampered with and was not revoked. Does that assertion worth something in terms of the fit to the job, in terms of risk management? That still is the role of risk managers, right? Like companies like SISE, but also risk managers within the organization. And if I know that Yoti has been certified by the UK government and by a bunch of other organizations, then I will trust them. But if the same credential will come from an identity provider that I don't know of and is not trusted, then I'm not going to accept it. And those policies and decision-making processes, they're still there. We haven't taken those completely down. So it's a conduit, yeah, we gotta go. It's a conduit to take out friction and not to enhance trust. Think about this.
Just this one question, like, trying to reconcile, how does that help with inclusivity, though, if someone's judging the quality of the credential provider? Shouldn't the viewer of the credential be the one to judge what they need? Because here's a use case I can see.
Again, what did you ask?
Shouldn't the employer, the one viewing
The relying party is the one.
So then why regulate?
We're not regulating, that's exactly what I'm saying. Not for practical reason and not for other more meaningful reasons. We're unable to regulate issuers and certify issuers unless they are a special kind of issuers like notary issuers, but we're unable to regulate in an open network that's supposed to carry millions of issuers, millions of businesses.
That's going to be our job as the inspectors. That's one of the remaining. You know, you might ask me why. And his
Eitan
background.
is killing us.
I know he's killing us, but it's an important. That's what we do. I mean, we look at credentials, look at the sources, and say, hey, is that source good or not?